In 1839, on the coast of southern China, a government official named Lin Zexu ordered a massive stockpile of opium to be destroyed. The drug had been smuggled into China for years, poisoning families, draining silver, and tearing holes through the Qing Empire. Within months, British warships were moving toward China. Officially, the war was about trade, law, and diplomacy. But beneath all of it was a very ordinary habit. Britain could not give up tea. Britain wanted Chinese tea so badly that silver flowed out of its economy and into China. When China refused most British goods in return, Britain found something else to sell: opium. That is the strange darkness inside a cup of tea. A drink associated with calm, manners, and quiet mornings helped connect empires, addiction, revolution, and war. This is the opening truth of tea. The softer the ritual became in one room, the harder the machinery became somewhere else. Tea looks harmless. It is a leaf in hot water. It sits beside books, breakfast tables, quiet conversations, and moments of comfort. But history has never treated tea as harmless. Tea moved silver across oceans. It made fortunes for trading companies. It shaped colonial policy. It fueled smuggling networks. It helped trigger the American Revolution. It pushed Britain into the opium trade. It was stolen through botanical espionage and replanted across conquered landscapes. And through all of it, tea became something bigger than a beverage. It became power. So how did a wild shrub from the mountains of southwestern China become one of the most consumed drinks on Earth, and one of the most politically dangerous leaves in history? To answer that, we have to begin far before Britain, before opium, before empire in the misty forests of Yunnan. That is the promise of this episode, not to ruin tea, but to show the hidden ledger behind it. The tea plant, Camellia sinensis, began in the humid mountain regions of southwestern China, especially around Yunnan. Long before tea became a ceremony, an empire, or an export, it was simply a plant growing in forests. Chinese legend says that around 2737 BC, Emperor Qinnong was resting beneath a tree while water boiled nearby. A few leaves fell into the pot, the water changed color, and the emperor tasted the accidental drink. The story is almost certainly legend. But legends survive because they carry a truth. Tea was first understood as something discovered between nature, medicine, and curiosity. In its earliest forms, tea was not a social drink. It was chewed, boiled, eaten, and used for its stimulating medicinal qualities. It cleared the mind. It sharpened the body. It gave warmth, energy, and focus. The plant was local, but the craving it awakened would eventually become global. For centuries, tea belonged mostly to China. It moved from local medicine to imperial culture. By the Tang dynasty, tea had become deeply woven into Chinese life. It was taxed, it was traded, it was gifted, it was studied. A writer named Lu Yu helped transform tea into an art. His work, The Classic of Tea, treated the drink not as a casual habit, but as something worthy of knowledge. The right water, the right vessel, the right preparation, the right state of mind. This matters because tea did not conquer the world first as a product. It conquered people as a ritual. It gave scholars a drink for thinking, monks a drink for meditation, officials a drink for ceremony, merchants a product for profit. Before tea became an empire's obsession, it became a civilization's language. Once a culture turns a drink into knowledge, it becomes harder to treat that drink as ordinary. Tea then crossed into Japan, carried by Buddhist monks who had studied in China. To them, tea was not simply pleasant. It helped the mind stay awake during long hours of meditation. Over time, Japan shaped tea into something uniquely its own. Matcha, powdered green tea, became connected to Zen discipline. The tea ceremony turned small movements into philosophy. The bowl, the silence, the kneeling, the pause before drinking. In Japan, tea became a practice of presence. In China, it had become scholarship, medicine, and refinement. In both places, tea was already far more than a drink. It was identity, it was class, it was discipline, it was culture. But for a long time, the rest of the world still knew almost nothing about it. This peaceful chapter matters because it shows what tea could be before empires learned how to weaponize demand. Europe arrived late to tea. Portuguese and Dutch traders encountered it in Asia during the age of oceanic trade. At first, tea entered Europe as a curiosity, foreign, expensive, medicinal, and fashionable among the wealthy. The Dutch brought tea into European markets in the early 1600s. The Portuguese helped introduce it to elite circles. But it was Britain that would become truly obsessed. When Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, married King Charles II of England in 1662, she brought with her a taste for tea. At court, the habit became fashionable. And once the court wanted something, merchants knew what came next: desire. Tea was small, light, and expensive. Perfect cargo for long-distance trade. Perfect fuel for an empire built on ships. At this stage, tea was still fragile in Europe, rare enough to impress, expensive enough to exclude, and foreign enough to fascinate. At first, tea in Britain was not democratic. It was locked inside polite society, a luxury for aristocrats and wealthy merchants. It sat in delicate porcelain cups, inside drawing rooms where social status mattered as much as taste. But luxury has a way of becoming addiction. As Britain's appetite grew, the East India Company became the gatekeeper. This company was not just a business. It was a state-backed engine of empire, with ships, armies, monopolies, and political influence. Tea gave the company a product people wanted again and again. Unlike silk or porcelain, tea was consumed and gone. Every cup created the need for another shipment. Every shipment tied Britain more tightly to China. A habit was becoming an economic dependency. Every chest of tea that arrived was already a small victory over distance, weather, disease, and risk. There was one problem. China did not need Britain the way Britain needed China. Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain were in high demand across Europe. But Chinese officials had little interest in most British manufactured goods. The imbalance was obvious. Tea flowed west. Silver flowed east. For Britain, this was dangerous. A nation could not build an empire by watching its silver drain away into Chinese markets. So, Britain faced a brutal question. What could it sell to China that Chinese consumers would keep buying? The answer came from India, where the East India Company controlled vast territory and revenue. Opium, the leaf of tea and the poppy of opium, became linked in one of the darkest trade systems in world history. This is where the story bends. Tea did not directly create opium, but Britain's dependence on tea made opium useful to empire. Opium had existed for centuries, but under the East India Company, it became industrial policy. Grown in India, controlled through colonial systems, sold through private traders, smuggled into China despite restrictions. The profits helped Britain solve its tea problem. Chinese silver paid for opium could be used to buy tea. The moral cost was pushed somewhere else, into Chinese homes, Chinese ports, Chinese officials, and Chinese families struggling with addiction. This is the pattern that appears again and again in the history of commodities. A product looks elegant on one side of the world because the violence has been moved to another side. In Britain, tea meant refinement. In China, the trade behind it helped open a crisis. The elegance of the tea table depended on a trade system that most polite society preferred not to see. By the 1830s, the Qing government could no longer ignore the damage. Lin Zexu was sent to Canton to stop the opium trade. He demanded that foreign merchants surrender their opium. When they did, he ordered it destroyed. For China, this was an act of defense. For Britain, it became an excuse for war. In 1839, the First Opium War began. British naval power overwhelmed Chinese defenses. Steamships, cannons, and imperial confidence forced open a civilization that had tried to control its own trade. The result was the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. China ceded Hong Kong. Treaty ports opened. Foreign power gained new privileges, and the old balance between China and the West was broken. All of this was connected to tea. A quiet drink had helped produce a violent crisis, and now gunboats would decide what diplomats and merchants could not. The Opium Wars were not only about tea. History is never that simple. They were about empire, trade rights, military power, legal authority, and the arrogance of industrial nations. But tea sat inside the economic machinery that made the conflict possible. Britain's demand for tea helped create the trade imbalance. The trade imbalance helped drive opium smuggling. Opium smuggling led to crises, crackdown, and war. That is why tea's history is darker than the image of a quiet cup. The cup hides the root. The root hides the ships. The ships hide the guns. And the guns hide the fact that empire often begins with an appetite that refuses to limit itself. This is the part of tea history people rarely put on porcelain cups. After war opened Chinese ports, Britain still had another problem. China still knew how to grow and process the best tea. The secrets were not just in the plant, but in the knowledge, which leaves to pick, how to dry them, roll them, oxidize them, sort them, and prepare them for long journeys. Britain wanted control, so it turned to espionage. In the 1840s, a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune traveled through China, disguised in local clothing. His mission was to collect tea plants, seeds, tools, and knowledge, then help transfer Chinese tea production into British-controlled India. It was not a polite exchange of culture. It was corporate and imperial theft dressed as science. In other words, Britain did not only want tea, it wanted to own the process that made tea valuable. The plan was simple: break China's monopoly. Britain already controlled large parts of India. In Assam, local tea plants were identified and cultivated. In Darjeeling, the Himalayan climate produced teas that would become famous around the world. Later, after coffee disease devastated plantations in Ceylon, tea would take over there too. A global tea empire was being replanted. But plantations are never just landscapes. They are labor systems. Tea needed hands, hands to clear land, hands to plant, hands to pluck the young leaves quickly and carefully, hands to carry baskets, process leaves, pack chests, and keep the empire supplied. The romance of tea gardens hides a much harder truth. Colonial tea depended on exploited labor. The empire was not satisfied with buying the leaf. It wanted to command the soil, the labor, the routes, and the price. Tea plantations became symbols of beauty in imperial advertising. Green hills, morning mist, neat rows, elegant boxes on shelves. But behind that image were harsh contracts, low wages, displacement, disease, and control. Workers often lived in isolated estates where employers controlled housing, movement, medical care, and wages. The conditions varied across regions and time, but the logic was familiar. Make the product look refined by hiding the labor that made it possible. Just as sugar carried the history of Caribbean plantations, tea carried the history of colonial plantations in Asia. One sweetened the cup, the other filled it. Together, sugar and tea became the taste of empire. The landscape became beautiful in paintings and advertisements, because the pain was kept outside the frame. While Britain fought to control tea abroad, tea was changing politics at home and across the Atlantic. In the American colonies, tea became a symbol of taxation and imperial control. On December 16, 1773, colonists in Boston boarded ships and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. It was not just about tea leaves. It was about who had the right to tax, who had the right to govern, and whether a distant empire could force its will on people across an ocean. Tea helped turn frustration into rebellion. A drink of comfort became a symbol of resistance. In America, tea became proof that a commodity could carry an entire political argument inside a wooden chest. This is what makes tea so powerful. In China, it was medicine, culture, scholarship, and statecraft. In Japan, it became discipline and presence. In Britain, it became class, domestic ritual, and empire. In America, it became rebellion. In India and Ceylon, it became plantation labor and colonial profit. The same leaf took on different meanings depending on who held the cup. For some, Tea meant refinement. For others, it meant taxes. For others, addiction. For others, labor. For others, survival. Tea was never only about taste. It became a mirror. And every empire that touched it saw what it wanted to see. This is why one channel can tell so many stories through objects. Objects travel, and when they travel, they collect power. By the 19th century, tea had moved from luxury into daily life. Falling prices, expanding colonial production, and changing taxes made tea more accessible to ordinary British households. Sweetened with sugar, it became a quick source of warmth, energy, and comfort. For industrial workers, tea fit the rhythm of the factory age. It was cheap enough to drink often, hot enough to comfort, caffeinated enough to keep people moving, respectable enough to become a national habit. The tea break was not an ancient tradition. It was a modern social technology, a small pause inside a world organized by labor, clocks, and machines. The empire did not only conquer territory, it conquered daily routine. The daily cup became a way to make industrial life feel a little more human, even when the system itself was not. During the World Wars, tea became more than habit. It became morale. British soldiers brewed tea in trenches, ships, barracks, and bombed cities. In moments of fear, tea offered something familiar, a reminder of home, a ritual that said life had not completely collapsed. Governments understood this. Tea supplies were protected and rationed carefully. It was treated not merely as food, but as emotional infrastructure. That sounds almost absurd until you understand what tea had become. A cup of tea was Britain in miniature. Empire, labor, trade, class, comfort, endurance, and denial, all stirred together. When the world shook, people reached for the cup. And inside that cup was centuries of history. A kettle could not stop a war, but it could give people a ritual sturdy enough to endure one. Tea also became a global language of hospitality. In Morocco, green tea with mint. In Russia, samovars. In Tibet, butter tea. In India, chai. In Britain, black tea with milk. In China, countless regional styles. In Japan, matcha. Across the world, tea changed shape without losing its core. All true tea comes from the same species, Camellia sinensis. Green, black, white, oolong, pu-erh. These differences come from processing, oxidation, tradition, and taste. That is part of tea's genius. It is one plant that became many cultures. One leaf that learned to speak in different languages. But wherever it traveled, it carried traces of the power systems that moved it there. Tea's global spread proves that commodities do not simply move. They adapt, absorb, and become local while carrying foreign histories. So when we call tea peaceful, we are only telling half the story. Tea did create calm. It did create ritual. It did bring people together. It did give comfort to workers, soldiers, monks, scholars, families, and strangers. But tea also exposed the machinery of the modern world. Monopoly, taxation, smuggling, addiction, war, espionage, colonial labor. Tea shows how an ordinary object can become a lever. Pull it in one place, and silver moves in another. Tax it in one colony, and rebellion begins. Control its supply, and empires redraw maps. This is why tea may be the most powerful drink in history. Not because of what it does to water, because of what it did to the world. A leaf this small should not have been able to pull on so many parts of the world. But history is often moved by small things repeated at massive scale. Look closely at a cup of tea, and the surface looks simple. Dark liquid, rising steam, a quiet smell. But beneath it, you can see Yunnan forests where the plant began. Tang scholars who turned preparation into art. Japanese monks who made it discipline. Dutch and Portuguese merchants who carried it west. British aristocrats who made it fashion. East India Company officials who made it strategy. You can see silver leaving Europe, opium entering China, warships on the Pearl River, tea chests sinking into Boston Harbor, plantations spreading across Assam, Darjeeling, and Ceylon, hands picking leaves before sunrise, a soldier warming himself in a trench, a family pouring comfort during a blackout. The cup becomes an archive, and the steam becomes a kind of memory. That is the secret of tea. It hides scale inside intimacy. A cup fits in your hand, but its history stretches across continents. It is personal and imperial, calming and violent, spiritual and commercial, domestic and geopolitical. Tea did not merely travel through history. It helped push history forward. It helped build companies powerful enough to act like governments. It helped create trade routes that enriched some nations and weakened others. It helped drive smuggling networks, wars, revolutions, and colonial agriculture. And yet, after all of that, tea still enters the room quietly. No flag, no army, no map, just leaves, water, heat, and time. That contradiction is what makes tea perfect for dark history archive. It is gentle enough to be trusted and powerful enough to reveal empire. Today, most people do not think about any of this when they make tea. They boil water, drop in leaves or a bag, wait, drink. And maybe that is why tea is so powerful. It became so normal that its history disappeared into habit. But history does not vanish because something becomes familiar. The same was true of sugar. The same is true of silk, perfume, diamonds, tobacco, and countless other objects that look beautiful only because the darker parts of their story have been pushed out of sight. Tea teaches the same lesson in a quieter way. The world is often shaped not only by kings and battles, but by cravings, small daily desires, repeated billions of times, until they become trade, policy, empire, and war. A habit becomes dangerous when nobody remembers it is a habit. Tea is not evil. It is a plant, a drink, a comfort, a ritual. For billions of people, it is memory, family, patience, and peace. But the history around tea reveals something uncomfortable about civilization. We rarely desire only the object. We desire what the object promises: energy, status, belonging, refinement, control, escape. And when enough people desire something, systems rise to feed that desire. Ships, taxes, monopolies, plantations, smugglers, armies, treaties. Tea did not force empires to act brutally, but it gave them a reason. It gave them a market. It gave them a habit that could be taxed, protected, stolen, and scaled. That is why the quietest objects sometimes leave the loudest marks on history. That does not make tea guilty. It makes tea historical. The next time you hold a cup of tea, do not only see the drink. See the mountain shrub that became a ritual, the Chinese leaf that drained silver from Europe, the British habit that helped fuel the opium trade, the warships that opened ports by force, the stolen plants carried into colonial India, the workers whose hands made empire taste civilized, the tea chests floating in Boston Harbor, the soldiers brewing comfort under fire. Tea looks peaceful because the violence around it has been folded into the past. But the past is still there, rising with the steam. Tea is never just tea. It never was. If this story changed the way you see the world, subscribe to Dark History Archive and tell us in the comments, what surprised you most? The Opium Wars, the Boston Tea Party, the stolen tea plants, or the hidden labor behind the world's favorite drink? And that is the final lesson. Comfort can be real and still carry a cost.